Shalini Taneja, Area Chair Economics and Business Policy Area, along with my colleague, Professor Basant Potnuru and Professor Rupesh. Extend a warm welcome to one and all. And let me brief about FORE School of Management. The FORE School of Management, that is Foundation for Organization, Research and Education, which is committed to the advancement of management, education, research, training, and consultancy. It's incorporated in 1981 as a non-for-profit institution. So FORE has been working with the industry and academia for developing new domains of managerial thought, education, and contributing to building leaders in today's global business environment. We have been organizing various national and international conferences, seminars, webinars, training by inviting various national and international eminent speakers in the different domains of management from time to time. To continue this legacy, today Economics and Business Policy Area, along with the Academics Office, FORE School of Management, New Delhi, has been organizing this Global Leadership Lecture under the Global Leadership Series. So we have with us Professor Antoine Reberioux, Professor of Economics from the University of Paris, France. And it is my pleasure to introduce our international speaker with all of you. Professor Antoine Reberioux is a professor of economics at University of Paris, France. He's also the research fellow at LADIS, the University of Paris, and research associate at Crédit, the University of Antibes. He's currently the associate editor for the Revenue Economics and the coordinator of the master's degree Economic Policies in the Age of Globalization Plus, Erasmus Mundus for the University of Paris, and also the Deputy Director for the PhD program 624 Sciences Tea Society. His research focuses on corporate governance, corporate social responsibility, and industrial relation. And he's also interested in comparative, like in international analysis, and he has published various national and international research paper in various international peer-reviewed journals, such as Journal of Corporate Finance, the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, the Socio-Economic Review, the British Journal of Industrial Relation, the Cambridge Journal of Economics, or the Journal of Common Market Studies, among others. Today, he will be sharing his thoughts on the contemporary debates on the corporate governance, and the theme is corporate governance for the social and ecological transition.
So, sir, we are highly delighted with your gracious presence, and it is our honor to host you. We are keen to hear you. Over to you, sir.
Okay, so I'm gonna start. So first, thank you very much to Professor Rupesh Kaushish, Shalini Taneja, and Professor Basant Potnuru. It's really a great honor to be able to join you today and to present the FORE School of Management. So again, thank you very much. So as Professor Taneja just said, I'm Professor of Economics at the University of Paris, which is now the biggest university in Paris, actually. And my research interests are like corporate governance, employment relation, gender equality, and institutions also. And I'm going to share my screen, right? If you agree. Okay, so let me try to do so right now. Okay. So tell me, you see my screen, right?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay, perfect. So as you see, the title of my presentation is going to be corporate governance for the ecological and social transition. And I'm going to go into the detail in a minute so that you will understand my what I want to say here. And before starting, just let me say that please do not hesitate to interrupt me if you have any questions. Well, you disagree with me, or if you want to challenge me, I will be very happy. I will try to do my best answering your questions, right? So, sorry, just, okay. So let me start by giving you a broad outline of my presentation for today. And so I'm going to start with I would say, a really common diagnosis, which is that the world economy or global capitalism is facing multiple ecological, environmental, social challenges, so that there is a need for a global transition toward, I would say, a more sustainable economy. And then I'm gonna discuss the role of private companies, firms, into this process of transition. And in particular, I'm going to focus on corporate governance, so decision making at the top of firms. So with Professor Rupesh Kaushik and Shalini Taneja, we have decided that not to present a particular research of my own, but rather to have let's say a broad overview of question that I consider, and I hope you will consider as well, that I consider to be important, and question that I came across my career. So I won't be able to provide definite answers, but rather I want to raise questions and, well, discuss the literature and the way I see it. On corporate governance, more precisely, there are three questions I want to discuss with you today. So the first one, is it appropriate or not to reduce, to tame, I don't know if the word tame is appropriate, but to reduce financial pressures on companies from stock market? And if yes, how can we do so? And the second question will be question regarding what we call managerial accountability or firm responsibility. And there are currently important debates in law, in management, in economics, or in sociology regarding a new social responsibility for companies, for firms. And I want to discuss a bit with you this question that I consider to be important. And then the last point will be on corporate board. And in particular on, you know, that boards are really the locus of power within large companies. And there are also discussion on board diversity and whether or not board diversity might be a support or might trigger this transition toward a sustainable economy. So it will be my third point. And I've made a lot of research over the past decades on corporate board. Okay, so okay, so let's start with the very briefly. When I say multiple challenges, obviously we have first ecological and environmental challenges. I'm going to be quick on this one because you know you know the discussion. But let's say that challenges are like how to maintain viable, diverse ecosystems, and obviously how to maintain a sustainable climate. You know that with the Paris Agreement enacted in 2016, we are supposed to reach carbon neutrality in the second half of the 21st century, so as to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius as compared to pre-industrial levels. But you also know that this is a broad objective, but there are then a lot of heterogeneity across countries. And for instance, if you take, well, my country, France, we are supposed to achieve carbon neutrality in about like 25 years, so in 2050. And if you take India, well, which is, you know, the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases around the world, well, for the moment, if I'm right, India did not announce a deadline regarding carbon neutrality, but India strongly committed to cut the emission intensity of GDP. If I'm correct, in particular, the idea is to reduce this intensity about 1/3 in 2030 as compared to 2005 levels. So it's a huge, definitely a huge effort for all economies. Now, but I would say that these ecological challenges are not the only one we are facing, and there are also social challenges. And when I say that, I mean, for instance, consider here the evolution of inequalities around the world over the past, let's say, 4 or 5 decades. So this graph is from Thomas Piketty. You probably know Thomas Piketty, and French economist who has been very active in the economics of inequality over the last 20 years. So this graph, you see the evolution for India, the US, Russia, China, and Europe of the share of top decile, so the 10% of highest incomes in total national income from 1980 up to now, basically. And well, I'm not be too long on this graph, but because basically we know the story. But you see that, we observe a strong increase in inequalities in every country. Russia might be an exception here, but okay. And well, it's very clear in the US, and as you see, it's particularly clear in India. India is in purple here. Okay, so strong increase in inequality. I would say that 20 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, actually, it seems to me that inequalities, at least for economists, were not really a topic. I mean, we were all aware that there were within country inequalities and across countries, obviously, but I would say that the global perception was that, well, those inequalities were really driven by technology, by technological progress, and as a matter of fact, inequalities were more or less considered as a price to be paid for progress. So the real focus was rather progress, growth, and there were not so much interest for inequalities. I think that things have changed. So I was mentioning Thomas Piketty. So he's a very good example. We know that his work are now very famous around the world. And so I think it's fair to see that now things have changed, and a number of analysts, academics, commentators, politicians alike now converge on first the origin of these inequalities. And there is this idea that they are not only technology driven. Obviously, technology is for sure impacting inequalities, but it's not the end of the story. They are also related to institutions. Many different examples. I'm going to be quick on this one. Labor laws, for instance, the existence or not of a minimum wage, system of collective bargaining at the firm level or at the industry level. Obviously, the tax system, whether or not the tax system is progressive. So the idea is that institutions are important to understand the evolution of those inequalities. And I would say also that there is a convergence, or at least, regarding the consequences of these inequalities. I mean, I would say that if this is a price to be paid for progress, the price seems to be very high, because we are now quite aware that those inequalities might be a real danger for social cohesion within the country, a real danger for democracies, and those inequalities might fuel populism. I'm not going to talk about India, obviously, but if you consider the, let's say, Western world, so the US or Europe, well, it can be argued that what's going on in the US with this very political tensions and Trumpism, and what we have seen in the UK with Brexit, those very factual elements might be to some extent related to growing inequalities. So really, I think, and I'm not the only one, that inequalities and the rising inequalities represent a clear challenges for the world economy. If you want to see more of this institution approach of inequalities, I strongly recommend you to read this paper by my friend and colleague Simon Deakin from the University of Cambridge, UK, with a very, very interesting analysis, very powerful analysis. Okay, so now let's say that we agree that there is a need for a global transition. So obviously, who will be the actor of this transition? I would say us as consumers, as citizens. Also, definitely a major role for governments, for states. Should increase carbon price so as to favor investment in cleaner, renewable energies. I'll be back on that. Well, we need public investment in new technologies. I have in mind in particular carbon capture and storage technology, because if you want to reach, carbon neutrality, not only we will need to decrease carbon emission, but we also need to neutralize the rest. So we will need this kind of technology able to capture and storage emission. The states might intervene through fiscal policies with like more progressive tax system, and if really institutions matter, then there is room for improving labor law, labor standards, for instance, minimum wage. And if you take the British example, we are observing a net clear increase in the minimum wage currently, after years of like stability. But and it is where I want to insist, into this global transition, there is also a major role for firms, for companies, and in particular for listed companies. Why? Because first, we know that, well, listed companies as a population, it's quite a small number of companies, but whether in the US, Europe, in India, and so on, those listed companies are definitely the main vehicles, main engines of wealth creation. And they are also the main producer of negative externalities. I mean, negative ecological, social externalities because of their power as economic agents. And, well, if you consider the role of companies into the story, well, I would say that you all know, at least those who have made a study in economics, you all know the Pigouvian story. So in a Pigouvian world, but you can say that, well, when you have externalities, basically it's not very complex. Governments should intervene and designing like proper regulation, norms, taxes, and then companies should just like maximize their own profits within this regulatory design, and we will be able to achieve a efficient outcome. Well, I mean, not many economists really believe in this story. I mean, we all know that in the real world, out of this Pigouvian world, it's impossible for regulators to efficiently manage all negative externalities. Obviously, states and governments are able to design some regulations, but not well, not to manage all negative externalities. We have like asymmetric information, problem of control, problem of enforcement, and so just like we have market failure, there are also public policy failures. So the point is, when you have this kind of public policy failures, it means that, and you have negative externalities, finally encouraging firms to maximize their short-term yearly profit is in fact encouraging them to maximize negative externalities. So from a social economic point of view, well, it makes no sense to push companies to maximize short-term profits when you have negative externalities and public policy failures, which is rather common. And well, in this case, And obviously, this is here the relation with corporate governance, and I'm going to be back on that. Well, in this case, firms should, by themselves, companies should, by themselves, internalize part of their negative externalities. Otherwise, we are never going, well, we won't succeed in this transition story or objective. Okay, so let's say that I'm gonna continue. Now, what about investment? So not only if we want to succeed in this transition, we need, we definitely need like taking into account like the many different externalities, but we need companies to invest in like new technology. So we need long-term investments. Well, to reduce greenhouse gas emission, to capture the rest. But if you consider social challenges, I think it's to some point it's also a question of investment. Well, thing is, if we want to, I would say, have high quality jobs with fair level of compensation, good working conditions, workers able to balance their personal and working life, workers being able to invest and to develop their own expertise and competences. Well, all this matter, I would say that high quality jobs require significant investments by companies in human resource management practices. I told you that part of my research, so part of my research are in corporate governance, but I have also, different researchers and papers in I would say, labor economics. And I don't know if you know this one, but this literature on internal labor market. So this concept of internal labor market was pioneered by Doringer and Pyrie in a classical book, 1971. The exact title of the book is Internal Labor Market and Manpower Analysis. And it's really a fascinating book because, well, remember I told you that in economics, inequalities were not really at the core of the analysis 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Well, it's not true for Doringer and Pyrie, and actually they are among the first to have pointed what we call labor market segmentation. So it means that we have a primary segment or labor market with jobs of very high qualities. And this is a result of firms acting as internal labor market, firms investing in their human resources, firms spending on training, on working conditions, and so on. And on the opposite, you've got the secondary market, the secondary segment of the labor market with jobs of like very poor quality, very poor remuneration, and here mainly constituted of firms not investing in their human resource practices and management. So here again, whether we consider ecological challenges or social challenges, definitely firms need to invest on the long run. But I think it's part of the problem. It's part of the problem because it's exactly the same when I was just saying that firms need to integrate negative externalities by themselves. The thing is how to make firms really integrate negative externalities, how to make firms really invest on the long run. It's not that easy, and you probably know the story. It's not easy because firms operate in a given economic system, and for the moment there are some evidences that, well, this system is putting, to some extent, short-term pressure on companies. Well, could have many different examples. Let's take this one, okay? It's a quote. It's not an academic quote. It's a quote by Eric Lombard. So you probably don't know, there is absolutely no reason for you to know Eric Lombard. Eric Lombard is the CEO, so the Chief Executive Officer of La Caisse des Dépôts et Consignations. So La Caisse des Dépôts et Consignations, it's a very exotic French name, but La Caisse des Dépôts is the main public institutional investor in France. So it's basically a sovereign fund belonging to the French state. And well, La Caisse des Dépôts et Consignations has many different, very strategic block holdings in many different industries in France and around the world. So it's a sovereign fund, the main in France. And here is the way Eric Lombard is analyzing the current situation. He said the following: as an investor, we have to manage these contradictions between transition investment and short-term economic performance. Shareholders are asking for a return of 7 to 8%. This requirement is a real brake on investment in the ecological transition. It would be necessary to accept that companies should set themselves a more reasonable profitability target. So, obviously, the problem is that companies are not real person. They are legal person, for sure. And so, to understand how a company could set themselves a more reasonable profitability target, or could themselves encourage internalize externalities, I mean, at some point, we need to enter the black box of companies, and we need to study corporate governance, and we need to understand that profitability targets are, to some extent, the result of pressure exerted by stock markets. So let's have a bit of evidence here. So you can hear me correctly? It's okay? Yeah? No problem with the sound, because you told me that the sound was a bit mild, or it's okay now? Yeah.
No.
Okay,
We
it's
can
okay.
hear
Please
you
go
loud
ahead.
and clear. Please
Yes,
go ahead.
Okay,
yes.
excellent. You tell me if I'm too quick or too slow. Just please. Okay. So I continue this way. Okay. Okay. So let's see a bit of evidence of this pressure exerted by stock market on listed companies. So here you've got an example for the USA, and this is the payout to shareholders for US listed companies from 1971 to 2016. So you've got the reference here, okay? And so the payout ratio to shareholders here, this is the payout ratio is net payout divided by operating income. And well, what you see basically is that, well, this ratio was rather stable from the 70s up to the end of the 90s, around, let's say, 12% here. Okay, so it means that in 1986, we had about 12% of the operating income that was distributed to shareholders. And what you see in the US is a significant clear increase of this payout ratio. And now we are about in the 2000s and 2010s, and this ratio is now about like 30%, even if it's quite cyclical. I have to admit that, obviously. And interestingly, there are two ways to distribute cash to shareholders. You've got the traditional way, which is dividends. Obviously, shareholders are entitled to receive dividends on the basis of corporate law and finance, okay? But there is also another way, I would say a new way. These are share buybacks, where firms simply buy back their own shares, and in the process, they pay cash to their shareholders. So it's quite interesting, I would say, if you want to see the role of institutions into the story. And if you consider share buybacks, so the second way to pay out shareholders, it's quite interesting to note that actually buybacks were illegal in the US until not recently, but until 1982. So it means that for like 3, 4, 5 decades, they were forbidden. They were considered as a form of stock manipulation, not only in the US, It was the same in Europe and in most countries across the world. And so in the mid 80s, they become allowed in the US, just like in many countries, in India, in Europe. And if you consider the American situation in 2019, US companies spent more than, well, you've got the figure here, the number, spent more than 1,200 billions of US dollars on share buybacks. So it's more, much more than dividends, actually 150% of dividends. Well, there are different reasons why you want to distribute cash through buybacks rather than through dividends. And there are like taxes, fiscal consideration, because dividends are taxed as ordinary income, while buybacks are taxed as capital gain. And so I think in this story, the Indian case is very interesting. In 2019, if I'm right, if I'm correct, the government, the federal government, decided to equalize the tax treatments of dividends and buybacks in India. And so interestingly, we observed that, well, a strong decline of buybacks. Well, so you see how institution can somehow here, or legal provision can somehow affect those distributional story. Now, consider the European case. I think it's really interesting. So in this graph, so I hope you see it clearly. So sorry, the graph is in French, but I'm going to translate it basically. This graph, what you see is, so in yellow, this is the amount of, in dollars, in trillions dollars, US dollars, the amount of stock emission in yellow, okay? And in, I don't know if it's blue or green, in blue or green, you've got the amount of stock buybacks, share buybacks, repurchase. And so the difference is net emission. So it means that if stock emission are larger than stock buybacks, stock markets bring more money to companies that they receive from them, and the opposite if share buybacks are larger than emission. And so the net emission is the purple line here, okay? And what you see here is that, well, over the past 3 years, in Europe, so it's really clear in 2019, for instance, you see that, well, share buybacks have been larger than share emission. So it's so that the purple line is negative, and the amount is about 150 billions of US dollar. So I think this graph is very striking, or intriguing at least, because we used to hear that the raison d'être, the purpose of stock market, is to provide companies with funds so that those companies can invest. And again, we definitely need investments to succeed in this transition. But what you see in Europe is exactly the opposite. Over the past 3 years, stock market have rather extracted money from companies more than they have more than what they have bring to companies. And let's say that 150 billions of US dollar is approximately the GDP of Hungary or Greece. I know that obviously from an Indian point of view, it's not that much, but still it's significant, really significant. Well, so now let me take now 25 minutes to discuss corporate governance in this global framework. So, question: how to encourage companies in engaging in investing in the long term, or how to encourage companies in internalizing negative externalities. So, which corporate governance for the global transition? Once again, I do not pretend to give you like definite answers. Rather, I want to discuss ideas. It's rather food for thought. So, first line of reflection. I'm not going to go deeper here. It's question to how to reduce to some extent financial pressure from short-term investors. Well, there are different debates in the US, in Europe, probably in India. So how to regulate stock options, how to regulate free shares as a way to compensate CEOs, how to regulate share buybacks. We have just seen the somehow the role of share buybacks into the story. And there are also debates on how to favor the emergence of long-term investors. For instance, in the French case, since 2 or 3 years, there is a new law, corporate law, where it is possible to allocate double voting rights to long-term investors, to investors that have stayed in the equity capital for more than 2 years. So it's a way to leverage, to increase the power of long-term patient investors. Well, I'm not aware of any research on this one. I'm not saying that it's a good way to do. I'm just saying that it does exist, and so we need more evaluation whether or not it works, whether or not it might increase long-term investment. I'm not so sure. This is an ongoing debate. So let me rather discuss what I've called here increasing managerial accountability or redefining firm responsibility and board diversity. So before starting with that, I know you know that, but let's say it's, I think it's better to say it right now so that you clearly understand my point after. So when we consider listed companies, and again, listed companies are really the earth of the story. I mean, it's like in the US, in India, in Europe, it's more than 50% of GDP, value added, and so on. When you consider listed companies, at least from a legal point of view, the locus of power, these are not shareholders. These are not executive officers and the CEO. From a legal point of view, the locus of power is the board of directors, or in Germany we say supervisory board, but it's not very different. So board of directors or supervisory board, basically it's the same. This board and these directors, for large company, it's about like 15 directors, okay? This board is entitled with taking the most important strategic decisions, and this board, as you can see here, is also responsible to, nominate, terminate the CEO, the chief executive officer, and to fix her or his compensation. So once again, from a legal point of view, if you want to know who are the boss in a company, consider the board of directors. And interestingly, I'm going to be back on that. In most countries, shareholders are, have the power to nominate directors in general meeting, but not in all countries. In some countries, European countries, I'm going to be back on that, workers, employees are also able to nominate at least some directors. I'll be back on that. And so my discussion will really focus on board of directors up from there, right? So let's consider firm responsibility. This question, or you can say firm responsibility, firm accountability, managerial accountability, it's really a long-standing debate in social science, in law, over the last century. And the question is, the ultimate question here is, what is the ultimate responsibility of the firm? Whose interest should directors and CEOs and other executive officers serve? And by basically, I think you know the story, but let me be like a bit harsh on this one, but I think there are only two possible answers. And depending on the period, one answer or one theory is dominating, and so it's a never-ending story, I would say. The first possible answer is shareholder primacy. The champion of shareholder primacy would be Milton Friedman, the economist. So the answer is very clear. Directors and CEOs should serve the sole interest of shareholders. So if this is the case, the board of directors should be open only to shareholder representatives, as it is the case in the US, in India, in the UK, and so on. We've got another possible answer, which is, well, different names, but the idea is the same. Different names depending on the field, whether you are in law, in management, in economics. So this is a stakeholder value or approach, corporate social responsibility model, progressive model of corporate law. This is the idea that directors and CEOs should have a larger responsibility. Obviously, they need to serve the interest of shareholders. Shareholders have bring the money into the story, so their interest should definitely be taken into account, for sure. But they might be possible for directors and CEOs to balance this interest with other interests, the interest of workers, environment, and so on. And if it's the appropriate model of firm responsibility, then if the board really needs to balance various interests, then the board may include non-shareholder constituencies. So I think it's fair to say that back in the 90s or the 2000s, shareholder value as a theory of firm responsibility really dominated the debates. But I think it's also fair to say that things are changing. It's a little bit like inequality. And we have many different examples, evidence of a shift here with let's say an increase in the second theory, the stakeholder approach. Few examples. You've got here a quote by the US Business Roundtable. So it's a group of powerful CEOs in the US. So in August 2019, they enact a new statement on the purpose of cooperation. So I'm gonna read it with you. Each version of that document issued since 1997 has stated that corporations exist principally to serve the shareholders. It's clear shareholder primacy. It has become clear that this language on corporate purpose does not accurately describe the ways in which we and our fellow CEOs endeavor every day to create value for all our stakeholders whose long-term interests are inseparable. So I think it's a rather good example of the shift in the dominant vision we see regarding firm responsibility. Another example, completely different. This time it's not a statement by a group of CEO. It's civil law, a new law in France, the so-called French Pact Law, adopted 2 years ago in May 2019. And actually this law was meant to reform the Article 1833 of the Civil Code, which was unchanged since its first draft 2 centuries ago. And this article, Article 1833, is really the article of law that defines what is a company. So if you want to see what is a company in the French system, you need to read this one. So it defines what is a company and the purpose, the mission, the raison d'être of the company. So let's read this new draft together. A company must have a lawful purpose, obviously, and be incorporated, not managed, incorporated for the common interest of its shareholders. Okay, but the second sentence is really interesting. The company is conducted in its own interest and in consideration of the social and environmental issues related to its activity. So there is here a clear statement that obviously everyone agrees with that. Firms, companies are not non-for-profit organizations. They need to make some profit, obviously. So that's very clear. But it's different to say they need to make some profit. It's different to say that they need to maximize profit on a short-term, yearly basis. It's not written in the law, not at all. If you read the law, at least the French law, but you can do the same for many different countries, But you see that okay, they need to make profit, and they also need to take into account social and environmental issues. Well, you can say, well, this is just for civil country, and well, India is not a civil country; it's a common law country. Well, what about in the US? Well, we have the same debates in common law country, and in particular, I want in a minute say some words on a new, I would say, legal technology, new legal statute called the benefit corporations. So what we call benefit corporation is a new legal statute introduced in the US 10 years ago, so in Maryland. Now it's provided in about 40 states of the US. Okay, it has been introduced since then in Italy, in France, in Colombia, Ecuador, and there are ongoing debates in Chile, Australia, Argentina, Canada. So there is a real debate around the world on this new legal technology. What are the basic principles? What are the main principles of this benefit corporation? First, benefit corporation they are corporations, so they should make profit, but they should pursue a public benefit purpose, a specific mission, in addition to making profit. So they should make profit, but also doing something else. And the statutes should indicate this purpose. The board of directors should consider this purpose when defining the strategy. And very importantly, the benefit corporation cannot be sued by stakeholders, by shareholders, for having considered this purpose to the detriment of profit. So they are somehow shielded, at least from a legal point of view, from too much pressure by shareholders to maximize profit on the short run. And finally, there is the existence of an independent benefit director or commission who shall supervise the way the benefit purpose corporation, the benefit purpose has been pursued. So I'm not aware, it's quite recent, maybe not in the US, and there are not many researchers on that, but I think that it's quite an interesting perspective. And well, in the future, we have to consider the existence alongside like nearby classic corporation of this new legal technology, the benefit corporation. And it might be a support for the transition. Now, let's 10 minutes on board functioning and board diversity. It's okay, 10 more minutes or?
Yeah. Yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
You can take 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I'm in time. Okay, so what about board functioning and diversity? So once again, board is really the, let's say, locus of power within companies. And so my point is that if really you want to reorientate corporate governance, again, the background of the need for global transition, then necessarily at some point you need to focus on the board of directors, because this is really the most important well, board or element in terms of corporate governance. And so there are many different ways we can discuss board functioning and diversity in light of this transition. First, just a brief remark, and I think that in this particular matter, India is really, really interesting. You may know that if you consider board of directors, there is in Europe, in India, in the US, a clear division of task, of function within boards through dedicated committees. Now, most large companies have an audit committee, a nomination committee, compensation committee, a CSR committee, and well, usually, at least the US or in France, Italy, Germany, the UK, only the audit committee is required by corporate law or by corporate governance code. And from this point of view, I think that India is really somehow a pioneer, because India is really one of the first few countries to require companies So I know it's above a certain size, but requires, let's say, large listed companies to form a CSR committee. So a committee will be in charge of corporate social responsibility. So it's compulsory now within Indian boards. And I think it's really an example to consider when we have this discussion in Europe or elsewhere. But now, let's go back to Europe, which is my continent. So I want to talk with you about something that may seem very exotic for from an Indian point of view, but I hope I'm going to convince you that it might be a really interesting mechanism, which is co-determination. So what is co-determination? Basically, you have co-determination when you have employee, worker representatives sitting at the board level, so the board of directors or the supervisory boards, importantly, with voting rights. So the idea is not to have shareholder representative with all the voting rights and some worker representative but with no rights. The idea is to have in a board shareholders representatives and worker representatives, both entitled with voting rights on the strategy, voting rights on CEO nomination, termination, and so on. So as such, co-determination really means a direct worker involvement in strategic decisions or direct worker empowerment in corporate governance. So let's say a few words on this one and the connection with the transition. First, to be clear, co-determination is it's not just an idea of like an academic who is not really with no knowledge or expertise of the field. If you consider European Union, actually half of European Union member states provide co-determination by virtue of corporate law. I mean, co-determination is compulsory. It's not an option. It's compulsory in exactly half of EU member states currently. You've got the list here. Germany, Australia, Croatia, Hungary, Netherlands, Denmark, Finland, France, Sweden, Norway. The last line is Norway. I know that Norway is not part of the EU, but okay. And what you have, so in all these countries, in large listed companies, you've got worker representative at the bottom. It's compulsory. And in the first column, you've got so-called co-determination rate. This is a share, a fraction of the share of worker representative as a total of board members. So you see that in Germany, for large companies, we have about strict parity with 50% of worker representatives and 50% of shareholder representatives. And I would say that the norm in Europe currently is about 30%. So 1/3 of board seats reserved to worker representatives. So don't have time to describe this one. Well, it's really like continental Europe, but if you consider, I won't be able to discuss with you the Indian debates here, but if you consider, I would say Anglo-Saxon countries, by Anglo-Saxon I mean the USA or Britain, well, you can see that there are also debates here. In 2016, for instance, Theresa May, she was then Prime Minister, sought to implement co-determination within large British companies before she retreated here. And in the US, it was part of the Labour platform of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Remember, they were candidates for the Democrat side. So there are debates in the Anglo-Saxon countries. Now, very briefly, if you consider the literature in economy, in management, you've got now, I would say, a certain amount of researchers on co-determination, okay? And part of these researchers are theoretical, trying to pinpoint, to examine the possible benefits and costs of co-determination. So the benefits, likely benefits of co-determination, it can, for instance, I'm going to be quick on this one, it can, for instance, increase labor productivity through better identification of workers to firm decision. And obviously, it can increase, can make board taking better decision because worker representatives do have like firm specific expertise. So they may change the way the company is governed, is run, and the way company invests and so on. Okay, but I know this is economic, this is management, so there are benefits, there are probably costs also. It's very clear. And so you've got a couple of possible costs mentioned here. Deadlock in decision-making process, increase in labor costs, so maybe a decrease in financial returns. Maybe for the topic we are discussing together, for the transition, an open question, but once again, it's really an open question, is whether or not putting non-shareholder constituencies, worker constituencies, workers, representatives at the board level, whether or not it can have a beneficial effect on job quality, ecological performance, corporate social responsibility. Well, I'm not really able to answer, but it's clearly something that we need to consider as an avenue for future research. We have a bit of evidence, okay? There are 20 or more studies using large micro databases. And well, for the moment, I'm trying to observe the consequences of co-determination. Basically, I would say that having read all these studies, I would say that for the moment, it seems that co-determination has no consequences on financial performance, neither positive, neither negative, but it is associated with increase in job security. So it seems to have like being associated with better job quality. Also, you've got this really interesting story, new one by Jaeger, Schoeffer, and Heinisch, 2021. And so they estimate the causal impact of co-determination. This is Germany here. And they are able to not demonstrate, but they observe that co-determination is associated with larger capital stock, larger labor productivity, fewer outsourcing, once again, larger job security. So more investment, more job security, but indeed no wage premium. So no consequences in terms of wage. So my point here is that there are no definite answer as to the consequences of co-determination, but I think co-determination is really a European model of corporate governance, which is interesting to consider, and it might have some important, significant effect on the way companies would be able in the near future to, well, invest on the long run, internalize externalities, and so on. This is my point. And finally, 5 minutes is okay? Okay, 5 minutes, and it's over, I promise. Okay. Well, the last point I want to...
We'll take some questions too.
Yeah.
Sure. We shall take some questions too.
Yeah, I'm totally open to any questions. Sure. Tell me if you, yeah, sure. So, do you want me to finish this one and then answering the question, or?
Fine. Yes. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Just finish this, and we'll take.
Right. Okay. 5 minutes. The last point I wanna discuss with you is about gender diversity. Is in leadership positions, and when I say gender diversity in leadership positions, in particular, I wanna discuss about gender diversity in corporate boards. Well, you know that it's really an ongoing debate with a lot of papers, a lot of researchers, a lot of discussions among politicians, a lot of new law. Why? Because there is really evidence of segregation based on, you know, long-standing stereotypes against women in leadership. And so I don't have any figure for India, but it's basically the same. If you consider the share of women among top CEOs, Standard & Poor's 100, so in Britain, in the US, in the UK, or SBF 120 is for France, okay? But you see that, well, the share of women acting as CEO is incredibly low, less than 10%, and well, almost 0% in France. 5 or 6% in the UK. So it's it means that if you consider the FTSE 100, you've got like 2, maximum 3 CEO, female CEO out of 100 CEOs. Now, if you consider boards, it's basically the same. At least in 2010, 10 years ago, you had always a share of women, of female directors, inferior to 10%. So you know that in face of that, a number of countries, a number of jurisdictions have enacted board gender quotas, including India. You know that in India, since 2013, corporate boards need to have 1 female director, so it's a sort of quota. So we have a quota in India, in California, with 2 or 3 women acting as a director in board, and you've got quota in European Union. So this is you see the countries that have adopted quota in Europe, they are in red. So in red, this is countries with hard gender board quotas. So you've got quotas, the pioneer was Norway, you've got quota in Norway, you've got quota in Germany, Belgium, you've got quota in France, Italy, and you've got not quota, but let's say provision in corporate governance codes in Sweden, Poland, Portugal, Britain, or Ireland. So new law here, and well, now you see the effects of this law on a number of European countries. For instance, so on the x-axis, it was a share of women in 2007. So in France, it was France is on the top left corner, okay, in red. France had less than 10% of women in 2007, and now it's more than 45%. So in France, just like in Iceland, Norway, we have almost strict parity, gender parity in large company boards. Now, the question is, remember, we are dealing with transition. You certainly know that a very vast number of studies report that women have distinctive attitudes, preferences, career choices, that they are, well, not really highly represented in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I'm not saying that this is simple revelation of preferences, because we know that individuals tend to internalize what society is expecting from them. This is really stereotypes. But there are large evidence that women may have distinct preferences, values, attitudes. So, if this is the case, a relevant question is the following. Do women have a particular style of management when they're acting as director, as CEO, in terms of investments? They could be more sensitive to negative externalities, in terms of corporate social responsibilities, in terms of human resource management. And you see the point I want to make, I want to discuss with you. If the answer is positive, if women really have a particular style of management regarding those questions, then increased board gender diversity might support the global transition. I mean, increased board gender diversity obviously need to be supported as such because it's like basic equality, but also it might have like beneficial consequences regarding the transition. And here it will be really my conclusion. So 1 minute. Well, it's not very clear. It's not very clear because if you consider the literature, you've got actually 2 distinct alternative positions. First thesis, I would say, is the gender matters thesis. So in this case, gender matters thesis mean that women on average have different values, and those values would be more favorable to the transition. So an example, here is a quote by Christine Lagarde. She's French and she was the former director of the International Monetary Fund. She is now the chairman of the European Central Bank. And she declared the following in 2010: if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters, today's economic crisis clearly would look quite different. So there is this idea that women in leadership may change things. We've got also, it's not a quote, it's an academic study, Byron and Post, 2016, meta-analysis, and they say there seems to be a positive correlation between the fraction of female in boards and corporate social responsibility. Okay, but the thing is, it might be not so simple. We have also papers by really leading academics that tend to support the idea that if you consider things very with a lot of precaution, well, differences, gender differences might not be so strong. Okay, for instance, let's consider two papers by Judith Nelson, 2015 and 2016. Well, she provides new evidence that tends to mitigate the alleged gender differences. And in particular, she showed that when you control for, everything, when you carefully control in your regression and so on, well, there is finally not so much differences regarding risk aversions between women and men. You've got also, I would say, a similar argument in a famous paper by René Adams and Patricia Funk, 2012. So they have data on the preferences and values of directors in Swedish companies. And it's really interesting because what they show is that there is a strong selection effect. I mean, when they analyze preferences of female directors in Sweden, what they see is that basically those women, those female directors who have succeeded in breaking the glass ceiling, who have succeeded in becoming directors despite all the negative stereotypes, well, they have preferences and values that on average are not so different from the values and preferences of men, males. Well, this is really the end. My point here is just to say that, once again, the objective of this presentation was not to to have definite answers, just to, well, discuss with you some recent literature and trying to connect this literature on determination, for instance, from responsibility, gender diversity, to connect those debates, those researchers with well, the question of sustainable economy and transition. Okay, this is the end, and thank you very, very much for your attention. I hope it was clear. If not, I'm very sorry. Otherwise, I'm very...
It's very clear, sir. It's very clear. Thank you,
Okay.
Professor, for providing us with a new and highly interesting dimension of thought process. A very detailed and concrete presentation.
Okay, and, I do thank you.
Sir,
once
you have
again.
very well established a link between a broader paradigm of environmental consideration to the localized perspective of internalizing the extraneous cost or external cost by the firm. We are thinking in terms of, in fact, Kuznets curve. So when income increases, what will happen? Pollution actually it increases. But when income increases further, what will happen? Pollution, it will come down. But it won't be the case every time. So in short, actually, generally we are going to find that there exists a trade-off between efficiency and equity too. What actually you were talking about initially. In fact, in terms of inequality. And whatever actually you had mentioned, rightly actually you had pointed out that we need to maximize the shareholders' wealth in order to harmonize the goals of shareholders and existing regulation. We need to improve technology and institution and co-determination. So thank you so much, sir, for a very detailed, very informative, highly informative and interesting presentation. And the floor is open for discussion, debate. Anybody would like to share his or her insight or would like to ask any question?
I think there are questions in the chat now.
Yeah, there are questions in the chat box.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe, Professor Rupesh, why don't you read it out?
It is difficult for me to see. I need to click this chat box.
Yeah.
Just wait. Impact of co-determination. Wait.
Okay, let me try to see.
Let me read, sir. Now I can able to see.
Impact of okay. I think I've got got the chat. So
I think Shri Parna madam, she has raised one question. There are a lot of health inequalities caused by climate change. This can cause further damage in countries having greater income inequality. How should firm address this?
sorry, it's not so easy for me to hear.
Sir,
Okay,
there are a lot of health inequalities caused by the climate change. That is with respect to the
yeah,
environmental
sure.
negative impact of environment on health. So this
Yeah,
can
sure.
cause further damage in countries having greater income inequality. How
Yeah,
should
sure.
firm address this?
Yeah, it's
Regulation,
okay.
sir, would it be regulation or some
Yeah,
political institution they should intervene in order to somehow actually
yeah.
fabricate a kind of law so that they can
Okay,
take care of the environmental whatever actually devastation it is.
okay. Well, it's a really good remark, and obviously, it's impossible to have a very precise answer. I would say that what is meant through well, basically the way I try to analyze the situation is to say that we are facing environmental challenges, we are facing social challenges, and somehow for the sake of clarity, I separate the two, trying to think what we can do in terms of corporate governance to well face these social environmental challenges on one side, social challenges on the other side. Well, there is a common point here: is that in both cases, I think we need long-term investment. The common point, but as it has been clear in the question, in fact, we should not separate the two because clearly, these are cumulative problems, and indeed, we know it's very clear, and it's a terrible perspective. We know that climate change, global warming, destruction of biodiversity has very strong negative consequences in terms of inequality. The consequences of these changes are unequally distributed in the population. It's very clear. On the other side, we also know that the more unequal our society, the more damaging will be the consequences on the environment. So it's a terrible challenge because the problems, in fact, are not separate, or it's just not that we need long-term investment into that they are cumulative. So excellent question. What kind of law or regulation to face? Well, once again, nobody is able to answer. I would say that. Right. Yes, please.
Professor, what I feel, in fact, if we can go for some kind of cross subsidization, definitely it is on the part of government that it should take care of inequality.
Yeah.
Because in India also we are facing a situation of stagflation. On one side, actually, we are going to find that unemployment is very high, and on another side, there exists a price rise.
Yeah,
so
sure.
it is really a challenging state. So definitely government should intervene in order to somehow construct some health-related institutions.
Totally agree. Totally agree. I absolutely agree. And obviously, my talk was on corporate governance, so on companies. But I mean, we won't have any transition if only the states or governments are responsible for it, or only if like the market and companies are. What we need is a clear, well, complementary actions by the states and governments on one side, with like progressive taxes and designing proper labor law, proper corporate law, and so on, and also the action of companies on the other side. I mean, it's a mix of everything, plus consumers and citizens. So yeah.
What about Pigovian tax? In case actually we are going to find that the private cost, if it is higher in comparison to vis-a-vis social cost, then in that particular case, government should intervene in order to impose some kind of Pigovian tax, and thereby actually they can able to bridge inequality to some extent by providing the basic necessities. I think so. I'm not very sure about.
No, I can provide neither a definite answer. And you know the topic as good as I do. And so yes, once again, I was somehow critic with the Pigovian vision of the world, but in a sense, my point is that we absolutely need also Pigovian tax. I mean, it's really clear. For instance, I said that part of the problem is that companies do not invest enough on the long run, but because of, for instance, shareholder pressure or stock market pressure, but it's also because we all know that if you compare the return of clean energy on one side and carbon on the other side, clearly for the moment, the return of in clean energy is way too low. And so definitely we need actions by governments, by state to increase the price of carbon. It's very clear through equivalent tax, for instance. So it's a combination of everything. I mean, we need, as far as I see that, we need changes in labor law, in corporate law, in financial market law, but also we need proper environmental norms. We need well-designed taxes, and so on. So clearly, and just to answer, I think it's a remark by Professor Bazan-Potnourou. I totally agree with him. When I think you on the chat, you made a remark that, well, this kind of maybe like environmental protective law and so on might be used as a way to protect or to close borders and so on. I agree, but in a sense, as researchers, we need to be able, through our analyzers, researchers, and so on, to make the difference between laws that are properly designed for the common good and laws that just like increase protection to serve vested interests. So we need to be very careful because, well, many laws can not really serve the transition, but rather protect vested interests. It's very clear. It's very clear.
I think one more question.
There is another interesting question follows that. Can I read it out?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Are there studies? This is from Dr. Das, Dr. Jitendra Das. Are these studies to show the impact of higher or lower representation of workers in the governing board, resulting in higher or lower worker productivity?
Yeah. So I'm going to try to answer this one. Okay. And my answer this time, it's not going to be I don't know. The answer is yes. We have now a couple of evidences, hard-based evidences like microeconometric studies based on like causal estimator, difference in difference estimator that clearly show, and in particular, I think the study by Jaeger and others, 2021, that clearly show that presence of workers within board with voting rights, so contamination, is definitely associated with higher labor productivity and higher job security. That's for sure. What we don't know exactly regarding, for instance, return on equity, it's not so clear. So for the moment, we don't have clear evidence on that. But regarding productivity, yes. Regarding job security and job quality, it seems to be yes. Regarding corporate social responsibility or environmental performance, we don't have, well, it's really an open question. I would say some argue, I don't know if I do agree, just to finish with that. Some argue that,
yeah, is that the result of co-determination, he asks?
Yeah, the results of co-determination, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Causal effect of co-determination, absolutely. Yeah.
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 One more.
Yeah, just to finish with that, what we don't know exactly is the relationship between co-determination and CSR or environmental performance. On one side, you can say that, well, worker representatives may be more sensitive to environmental issues as compared to shareholder representatives. Why not? Why not? But we like clear evidence, clear survey. So, but on the other side, you've got example. Take the example of Volkswagen. You know this story of the cheat that U.S. regulators with like a defeating device in engine, and so it was not at all like corporate social responsibility. And some have noticed that, well, the board of Volkswagen was a clearly co-determined board with half worker representatives. So I'm not saying that co-determination is responsible for that. What I'm trying to say is that, for me, at least when you consider Europe, the relationship between co-determination and environment is really important. But at this stage of knowledge, we lack proper knowledge, and it's really an avenue for future research. And I consider to be an important point, definitely, just like we lack proper evidence relating gender diversity in corporate board with corporate social responsibility. It's an open question, a very important question, and there are some studies, but I would say no consensus for the moment.
Okay. Anita, would you like to answer this, or if you have not, from Sonak Chaudhary?
Yeah.
6:41 p.m. Thank you for such an insightful session. How much of an effect do you think current gender inequalities have on the economic challenges that countries and societies currently face, and how far has the new normal changed the trajectory towards sustainable economic transformation?
Yeah. Okay. It's
yeah.
It's a fundamental question. I mean, in my talk, and somehow I'm sorry for that. In my talk, because it was impossible to somehow to discuss everything, I tried to well, to consider what we can do in terms of corporate governance to favor this transition. And so I discuss gender equality just in terms of transition, let's say ecological transition, but it's clear, it's very clear that, I mean, gender diversity in leadership positions, but it's like in board position, but it's much more than that. I mean, it's gender equality regarding executive officers, and more than that, it's gender equality at every level at the workplace. I mean, for managers, for at every level. I mean, it's really something that we should consider per se. I mean, irrespective of, you know, there is, for instance, this debate, the business case argument. Some argue that having more female directors or would be good for the financial performance. My answer on this one is maybe or maybe not, but it's not the question, finally. I mean, we should support gender equality at every level, leadership position, but also within the workplace, irrespective or not, it has some effect on financial performance. It's another question. So, well, the question here in my talk was, could we make some relationship between gender equality and like environmental transition, for instance? But I really think that gender equality is a crucial problem, fundamental problem. It is as important as the ecological challenges we are facing. And so, as a researcher and as a citizen, I would say that I strongly support current legislation that try to, well, to increase gender diversity at every level in the firm.
I think there is another one from Professor Chiradev Bandyopadhyay. Climate change-induced migrations are affecting inequalities in income, access to healthcare, education, and employment. To what extent do you think can multilateral associations can tackle it?
Yeah, excellent question, obviously. With this question, we see how complex is the situation, because once again, in my presentation, I was really like analyzing the situation. I would say I try to be a bit comparative while discussing like something in the US, in Europe, or in India. But the thing is, well, it's really a global problem with like a lot of interaction across country and migration, obviously. And well, I'm not really able to provide a definite answer. My only possible answer here is to say, well, it's also definitely migration is definitely part of the problem. And just like we need to consider labor law, just like we need to consider corporate law, taxes, progressive taxes, there is a need, definitely a need for greater cooperation across like countries regarding this topic. I'm not able in 2 minutes to say more on this, but it's a fundamental question. Definitely, I totally agree with this one.
Okay, and the last one, it's from my side. Would it not be another form of protectionism, as
Yeah.
like the issues of child rights in the name
Yeah.
of child labor and agri-inclusivity in the international trade?
Yeah, sure, possible.
Possible. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also,
Thank you,
yeah.
Professor Rufez. Over to you.
Thank you. So shall we close the session?
Yeah.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay, so once again,
thank you so
thank you so much to everyone. And
yes, sir, please go ahead. Would you like to say something?
no, it's okay. It was just a final thanks because
Dr. Das would like to say
okay.
anything?
Let me give. Yes.
okay.
Professor Das, sir, would you like to say something?
Can't
Sir,
hear
you
you.
are
We
mute.
can't hear
Sir,
you,
you are
sir.
mute.
So
Sir,
you are on mute. Yeah, you are on mute.
Oh, I enjoyed listening. Don't call me in. It's your program. Okay. So thank you, Professor, for wonderful session. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very nice to hear.
Let me wind up this session. It has been very fascinating and very engaging. We have been very impressed and touched by the ability of the participants exceptionally. I think 616 participants so far actually they have joined, and I think they deserve a huge round of applause. Let me take this opportunity to thank Professor Antoine sir for amazing, thought-provoking and highly informative talk. Sir, we really loved every single second of the lecture. Thank you so much for providing us your valuable time and sharing the perspective and insight would be immensely helpful for our students in shaping their career. We are highly grateful to our director, sir, Dr. Jitendra K. Das, sir, Chairman, Dr. BBL Madhukar, sir, Vice Chairman, Dr. Vinayshil Gautam, sir, who always acted as a guiding star in taking the event forward. And besides, we remain grateful to Professor Sangamitra Buddhapriya, Madam, Dean for School of Management, Professor Hitesh Arora, sir, Dean Academic Services, and a special thanks to Professor Salini Taneja, Madam, and Professor Basant, sir, for effectively coordinating this event. I truly appreciate and remain highly grateful to our fellow colleagues all across the areas, whether it is marketing, IT, finance, accounting, OB, and HR, strategy, QT, and OM, for making the event successful. I keep on record our indebtedness to Professor Abdul Shaban, sir, Chairperson Center for Development Studies, TIS Mumbai, for recommending Professor Antoine sir's name. In addition, we are highly grateful to our administration, Anupam ji, Shiv Shankar ji, Mukesh ji, Finance Department, Bhuvan ji, Computer Center team, Neeraj ji, Uday ji, Bhavesh ji for providing us technical support. My special thanks to all our students, participants, audience for their unwavering attention throughout this presentation. Antoine sir, we have learned a lot and looking forward for more such sessions. Have a wonderful evening to all. Thank you so much.
Thank you once again. I hope we'll have the opportunity to continue this relation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We are looking forward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.